Good afternoon, and welcome to this session on an irreducible expectation. My name is John Zucchi. I'm your moderator, and our two speakers. On my right, we have David Brooks, who became He obviously needs no introduction. He, as you know, is a New York Times editorialist, a columnist. He also is a regular commentator on the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered. I have another 10 lines here I'm going to skip because I'm going to go straight to his little auto bio, if I can, from his 2015 bestseller. He says, "I was born with a natural disposition towards shallowness. I now work as a pundit and columnist. I'm paid to be a narcissistic blowhard, to volley my opinions, to appear more confident about them than I really am, to appear smarter than I really am, to appear better and more authoritative than I really am. I have to work harder than most people to avoid a life of smug superficiality." Don't you want to hear from someone like that? Now, Father Javier Prades is on my left. He does not have an unofficial bio because he doesn't need a hook because he writes academic theological books and doesn't have to draw the Good. Father Prades is a priest in the Diocese of Madrid, is the director of the Department of Dogmatic Theology and dean of the University of San Damaso of Madrid. He is the author of several books that he also co-authored with Monsignor Luigi Giussani and Father Stefano Alberto, Generating Traces in the History of the World, published by McGill Queen's University Press. So welcome to our speakers. In a recent piece in the New York Times entitled "Life Without Longing," the poet and writer Melissa Broder talks about a life filled with yearning, with longing, and tries to understand what it is that we long for. She writes of romantic obsession and the need to be loved, and how this led her in her life to attempts at self-love. One little quote: "What would I have done if I had actually landed on some final, immutable me whom I embraced with all my heart? For the sake of my own hunger for pursuit, I would have likely thrown her back in the water and kept looking. I would have been sad to give up the quest. She, like us, is looking for something. Like Pavese, what a great thought it is that truly nothing is due to us. Has anyone ever promised us anything? Then why should we expect something? We can't skip over this yearning, nor can we skip over this something that we all yearn for." And so David Brooks and Father Javier Prades will help us to understand this something inside of us and to appreciate its relevance for our times. David, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back at Encounter. It's 2 years ago I was here the first time, and Javier and I came to the same word when we thought about coming here, and that word was renewal. It's also a pleasure to be back on 18th Street. I grew up on 14th Street, 4 blocks away. When I was 8, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And so that was my enunciation moment, and I've been writing ever since. And the first thing I want to say to you is I'm not naturally, as I said, a deep person. I'm naturally a rational, shallow person. When I was in high school, there was a young woman named Bernice who I wanted to date, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so writing was in my blood. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And the great saying about Chicago, it's also very heady, very cerebral. The great saying about it, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so that was my education, very cerebral. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was at Chicago. Wasn't sure I should say that to a Catholic audience, but I And so I went off on my cerebral way. I'm a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I work in TV. But even in TV, I work in sort of the bookish end of TV. I'm on a show called The NewsHour on PBS, which I'm in a segment called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooke Shields. That would have been better, but they didn't go for that. But we cater to a cerebral audience, a somewhat older audience. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so we're very big in the hospice community. And so books have been my life. I've tried to get a little more spiritual as I've gotten older, but I've become a little more feminine, I think. I read a book. I'm the only American male to have finished this book called Eat, Pray, Love, if you remember that book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote a book about emotion, which was trying to get a little deeper. And then I wrote a book about character called Road to Character a few years ago. And I learned writing that book that writing a book on character doesn't actually give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So does buying the next book of the guy who wrote about character. So all this to say, I've lived my life head up. And yet I would have to say that the rational mind is only the third most important part of our consciousness. The first is our desiring heart, as Augustine taught us. I read about a guy who bought a house with a bamboo stand by the driveway, and he didn't like bamboo, so he chopped it down, and he axed into the root system. He dug a 3-foot hole, poured plant poison, 3 feet of gravel, 6 inches of cement. And 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo coming up through the cement. And in my view, we all have that. We have the desires of our heart, which never go away. We are, as somebody said, existential sharks. We have to be on the move to live. And what the heart yearns for more than anything else is fusion with another person. The kind of loving fusion that Louis de Bernier described in a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. In that book, he's got an old guy talking to his daughter about his relationship with his late wife. And the guy says, "Love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we discovered that we were one tree and not two." So that's what the heart longs for. The second part of the consciousness that forms our yearning is our soul. Now, unlike a lot of people in this room, I'm not in the business of persuading people that there's a God or not a God. But even before secular audiences, I tell them, I ask you to believe that you have a soul, that there's some piece of you that has no weight, size, color, or shape, but gives you infinite dignity. Rich and successful people don't have more of this than less successful people, old more than young. Slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another person's soul. Rape is not just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, it's an assault on someone's soul. And what this soul does is it yearns. As the heart yearns for fusion with another, the soul yearns for fusion with the good. I've covered wars, I've covered crime, I've covered genocide. I've never met anybody who didn't want to be good. And even people who do very bad things have some rationalization to explain why it's actually good. And what the soul yearns for is fusion towards some perfection, some moral perfection. The sort of perfection that Rabbi Wolf Kellman tasted on the bridge at Selma with Dr. King. He said, we felt connected in song to the transcendental, to the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest, most transcendental spiritual experience. And so our heart and our soul are really the yearnings and also the things that are pushing us forward, but really the things pointing to our ultimate ends, pointing not to a yearning and a longing, but a calling, something at the ultimate end that's drawing us backwards. Now, our society does a very poor job of talking about the heart and soul. We have a lot of great scientists who talk about cognition and the brain, and Danny Kahneman and our heuristics and our biases. We know almost nothing about our motivations. We don't tend to think about it. And as a result, our society has become something of a conspiracy against joy. We live in a society that's hyper-individualistic, that breaks off the connections between people and each other. And we see that in 45,000 suicides every year, 72,000 drug addiction deaths. People are just isolated and cut off from each other. And we see it in the way people are isolated and cut off from their ultimate ends, which is the transcendent good. I look at commencement speeches, which are American culture's chief sermon. And usually they hire someone with extreme career success to tell the students that career success doesn't matter. And then they say, oh, don't be afraid to fail. And from this, you learn that failure is really great if you happen to be J.K. Rowling. The rest, don't fail. Failing is not good. But they give people the habits of our age. Young people are going out of college, and my students are wanting to know what to devote their life to, what to commit to, what is their life for. And we say, be free, be open. That does them no good. Freedom is what they're drowning in. They want to know what to devote themselves to. And so then we say, your future is limitless. We give them this empty box of possibility. And they say, yeah, I know it's limitless, but I want to know what life is right and what life is wrong. And so where should the sources of authority lie? We give them the box of authenticity. Look inside yourself. You do you. Find yourself. Follow your passion. The you is the exact thing that's not been formed. And so they're drowning in freedom, drowning in possibility, looking for some sense of direction and guidance and wisdom, and we have nothing to say. And so some of them go off and lead an aesthetic life. They just treat life as a series of pleasures, one after the other, which never amounts to anything. Some of them become insecure overachievers. They decide they can solve the problem at their moral foundations if they build one success on top of the other. And my students come back years after graduation and they call me, and very often their voices have been crushed because they've had some setback. Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. If you know your ultimate ends, you can endure the setbacks, but if you haven't, you get crushed. I have a friend who lives in town here named Casey Gerald who was at a job interview, and he turned around and he asked the interviewer a question, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying, because if she wasn't afraid, she wouldn't be doing HR at that company. And so what they suffer from is what the Catholic Church used to call acedia, the loss of desire. Your life is over here, but your heart is over there. And I tell this about the younger generation, but I'm no different than anybody else. I grew up with the writer's personality. To be a good writer, it really helps to be aloof and a little cut off from other people. I tell young journalists, if you're at a football game and everyone else is doing the wave and you just sit there, then you have the right aloof personality type to become a journalist. A friend of mine named Christian Wyman says, the reason a lot of us write is because we can't really relate to people socially. We need some way to connect, so we do it through our pen. Wyman writes, a certain emotional reserve in one's life become a source of great power in one's work. So we're sort of solitary to start with, and then we've got a profession that keeps us alone all day. John Cheever was a writer up here, and he would get up, he had a Park Avenue apartment, he got up, he put on a suit, he rode down to the basement where his typewriter was, he took off his suit, he wrote in his boxers, at noon he put back on the suit, rode up the elevator and had lunch alone. That's the writer's life. And then if you succeed, they send you on book tour. I was on book tour for my last book 99 days in a row, 6 a.m. flight every morning. I counted at one point 42 meals alone at airports. At the end of that, I remember thinking, if you remember, Britney Spears shaved off her head, totally went crazy. I was like, yeah, I get that. I'm like that. I can do that. And so a lot of what the meritocracy does is it shaves us to be aerodynamic, to glide upward, not to attach, but to rise. And in my case, I came to desire the wrong things. I came to desire first reputation, how am I doing? How well known I am? Is my column being read? And second, and more poisonously, I came to idolize time over people. I came to want to be so productive that my relationship slipped away. And the wages of sin are sin. And you wind up in the depths. And in 2013, I was in the depths. My marriage had ended. My kids had left for college. My friendship were mostly in conservative circles, and conservatism has changed. I lived alone in an apartment, and if you opened up the kitchen drawers in my apartment, where you should have found silverware, you found Post-it notes. Where you should have found plates, you found envelopes. That was a life consumed by work and nothing else. And you know what I learned in that? I had total freedom. I was alone, I had money, I had some reputation, I was free. We're in a society that tells you to want freedom. I learned at those years, freedom sucks. Political freedom is great, personal freedom sucks. Don't be unattached. The unattached person is the unremembered person. But it gave me insight into moral renewal, which comes in 3 phases, and I'll just end with these 3 phases. 1, it breaks you open. People in times of suffering are either broken or they're broken open. If they're broken, they shrivel. If they're broken open, they grow. Paul Tillich, the 1950s theologian, said that what suffering does is it reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. It carves through the floor in the basement of your soul, and it carves through that floor and reveals a cavity below, and it carves through that floor and reveals a cavity below. And when you see those unexpected depths in yourself, you realize that only spiritual food will fill those cavities. It shatters the illusion of self-sufficiency. It sends you into exile from the regular flow of your normal life, and it sends you out into the wilderness. In moments of suffering, there's this weird mixture where some of the time you really got to be with people, but some of the time you've really got to be alone. In the Jewish tradition, there's a story of Moses when he was in the wilderness. He had a little lamb in his flock. He was a shepherd, and the lamb took off, and lambs are not normally that fast. But this lamb took off like a gazelle, and Moses ran after it and couldn't chase it deeper, deeper, deeper into the wilderness. And the rabbis teach us the lamb was Moses himself. He had to go deeper into the wilderness to find himself. And what's out there in the wilderness? The first thing that's out there is there's nobody to applaud your performance. And that's why solitude is necessary. The second thing that's out there is the sort of suffering that cracks through the ego shell. And the third thing that's out there is the thing that takes you deepest back into yourself, to the heart and soul. Annie Dillard wrote, "In the deeps are the violence and terror of which psychology has warned us. But if you ride these monsters deeper down, if you drop with them farther over the world's rim, you find what our sciences cannot name, the substrate, the ocean, or matrix, which buoys all the rest, which gives goodness its power for good, and evil its powerful evil, the unified field, our complex, inexplicable caring for each other." And this is Augustine. You go down into yourself, and you find down into yourself a highway right out of self, because you find your heart and soul which long to attach to one another. And so you have to be broken open. And then the second thing you find is after you're broken open, you still need somebody to help you out. In my view, nobody can lead themselves out of the wilderness. They need somebody else to reach in and grab them out. And I was grabbed out by 3 things. One was a community called AOK, a group of young people in Washington, D.C., with whom I had dinner every Thursday night and still do every Thursday. They're young kids, often from very broken homes. I went there the first time 5 years ago. I reached out my hand to introduce myself to one of these kids. He said, "We don't really shake hands. We hug here." And I'm not the most huggy guy on the face of the earth. But I hugged them, and they have a complete intolerance of social distance. They turn to you hungering for love like flowers toward the sun. And they pulled me out. My love for my wife pulled me out. What love for a man or a woman does is it carves off the top soil, the crusty stuff on top, and exposes the soft stuff below. It reminds you your riches are outside yourself. And the other thing about love is it wants to be on the move. A love for a person wants to lead upward to a higher love. And so the third thing that pulls you out is God. And some people find God in suffering and in the depths, and they feel humble and they need his help. And I get that. I've always liked the best that God offers. I've always liked the vision of goodness and transcendence and joy. I'm somehow more inspired by that. There was a woman who lived down here, I hope you've all known and read, named Dorothy Day. And at the end of her life, she was asked, "Are you going to write a memoir?" And she said, "Well, I tried to write one once." She was asked by a guy named Robert Coles. And she said, I sat there and I write a life to remember on the top of the page. And I sat there and tried to think of what to write, and I thought of the Lord and his visit to us all those centuries ago, and I was just grateful to have had him on my mind all that time. And she realized she didn't need to write anything. And that serenity pulls you forward. The second thing that you sometimes see is a moral beauty, a transcendence, a spiritual divine. I'm sure a lot of you know Henry Nouwen's work. My favorite Nouwen story, he was at L'Arche already, but he would go off to speak. And when he was go off to speak, he would bring a member of this community, a mentally disabled man, with him. And he was going to Washington to give a speech, and he brought a man named Bill. And when Nouwen came up on stage, Bill came up on stage. Nouwen spoke, and Bill sat behind him. And when Bill heard something he'd heard before from Nouwen, he would tell the audience, I've heard that before. And then at the end of Nouwen's speech, Bill said, I would like to give a speech too. And Nouwen was a little nervous. Bill was mentally disabled. He didn't know what he'd say. He might ramble on embarrassingly. So Bill said, last time when Henry went to Boston, he took John Smeltzer with him. This time he wanted me to come with him to Washington. I'm very glad to be here with you. Thank you very much. And he sat down. And the audience gave him a standing ovation. And after it was all over, Bill worked the room. Met everybody he could, shook hands, signed autographs. The next day at breakfast, Nouwen and Bill were leaving for the airport, but Bill wanted to say goodbye to everybody. So we worked the room, at the breakfast room at the hotel. And as they were flying home, Bill asked Nouwen if he liked the trip, if he had liked the trip. And Nouwen said, oh yes, it was a wonderful trip. I'm so glad you came with me. And Bill said, and we did it together, didn't we? And Nouwen thought of Jesus' words, where 2 or 3 meet in my name, I am among them. And that's the kind of moral sublime that touches something deep in ourselves and calls us to our end. Thank you.
Well, before I traveled to the States, I was told, well, you know, in contemporary America, you should always begin with kind of joke or a witty remark or something of the kind. And I thought, well, that matches me very well because my friends know I'm one of the funniest guys in the Western civilization. So I hope this has been enough because what is coming now is awfully boring. And besides, I have to read. I don't dare to speak like this, dealing with the issues I want to share with you tonight. So I will read. Before, I wanted to thank so much the organizers of New York Encounter and the translator and the host and all people, all volunteers who have made this wonderful event possible. It's a great occasion of being born again, just sharing the life you can touch here. Well, I will make 5 points. I'm a teacher. I'm a professor. I will 5 points. And the first one is a landscape of uncertainty. In his posthumous book, The Metamorphosis of the World, the late German sociologist Ulrich Beck opens with a statement that affects us all. He says, the world has gone berserk, it's disjoint and has gone mad, end quote. He acknowledges that his sociological formation does not provide a simple answer to the question, what is the meaning of the global events that unfold before our eyes on television screens? end quote. The world is no longer comprehensible to him. The usual sociological categories for describing sociological phenomena like evolution, revolution, transformation seem insufficient to explain the world that we have before us today. Beck thus incorporates into sociological language the category of metamorphosis. With it, he means to express not that the world is dying, but that rather it is experiencing, he says, a radical transformation, a metamorphosis of the horizon of references and action coordinates. And so the old certainties of modern society are disappearing while something totally new is emerging, end quote. His book is an explicit effort at finding a way to respond to this confusion and the sense of discomfort that accompanies it. This is the point of view that interests us. What is the collective diagnosis of our global situation? Believers, agnostics, and atheists alike are part of these secular and post-secular pluralistic societies of the West. The Polish philosopher and sociologist Bauman offered a description similar to Beck's when he warned that, at least in Europe, quote, we have entered into a scenario characterized by uncertainty and security. After the apparent solidity of modernity, we have entered into a liquid, this is his word, an unsubstantial period of time where many social forms appear incapable of offering realms of certainty or reference points for human action. The root of this uncertainty is found, he says, in our way of living, distinguishable for the weakening of interpersonal ties, the collapse of communities, the substitution of competition without limits for solidarity, the tendency to trust the problems of greatest impact to the hands of private individuals, end quote. Bauman directs his attention to this emptying of the human, personal, and social fabric which sustained Europe for centuries and which results in an uncertainty which affects all aspects of life. We find ourselves in a plural post-secular society with an outlook constituted by personal and social insecurity caused fundamentally by the disappearance of many of the certainties on which people built their lives. The evidence of these human values is discussed and debated, as we see in the many debates over what is reason or what is freedom or what value representative democracy has within the liberal social state of law or the value of community life versus that of every individual. As Peter Berger warned, we are not facing a minor problem, we are facing a difficulty with very serious social consequences, since as we lose these common grounds, we excavate what he referred to as the moral consensus without which no society can endure. Here's where I will locate my reflection in order to contribute to understanding moving beyond this difficulty we all share, taking into account precisely the originality of Christianity. 2 spaces of action. The first thing I want to affirm is that in order to move beyond the current state of things, mere reflection is not enough. While a conceptual elaboration is indispensable and it influences our action, what is required is something like what Beck himself refers to as cosmopolitan spaces of action, understood in his language as existential parameters of social activity. This is the technical language he uses. Existential parameters of social activity. Without claiming to transpose this technical language, I suggest that the changes in the many worldviews do not come primarily from the elaboration of an alternative theory, but rather from what he calls creative action in the cosmopolitan world, because such action does not accept the current frontiers of thought and action. There is therefore, in his opinion, a space of opportunity for those who enter into the cosmopolitan world starting from their creative action, starting from their own experience and what, in the language of believers, we could call our lived witness. This hyper-connected world, exposed to the temptations of extremism, becomes an opportunity to offer an understanding of what is human that avoids an elitist and exclusive worldview. This space of action can orient us in the direction of what Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells refers to as, quote, united forms of life which are rooted in ourselves and which counterbalance the collapse of communities and the tendency which we saw Bauman warned against to delegate the solution of our most serious problems to private individuals. In this situation, in fact, the metamorphosis is something not merely to suffer through, but even to encourage with hope. From these spaces of action, oriented towards the human horizon, it makes sense also to think again about the role of religion in the post-secular world. The role of religion needs not to be confined, for example, to debates on bioethical questions, as Jürgen Habermas suggests. Rather, it can provide places for personal and social construction, humanizing spaces that encompass all aspects of life. 3, the weakening of the self and of the community. Bauman, Habermas, Castells have all noted the weakening of human communities as spaces capable of developing free people, while Beck seems instead to emphasize the primacy of individual experience and sees community dimension as derived from that experience. The importance of the spaces of action that he advocates clearly demonstrates also a community dimension. Perhaps we should take more time to study which is the relationship between individual and communal dimension of human experience, taking it as given for now. I will give priority to the consideration of the weakening of human dimension, considering the aspect of each person, each self, each of us, which will also offer lines for social action and community construction. I do share the diagnosis that there has been a weakening of communal ties in the Western world. In my view, this is a reflection, among other factors, of the weakening of what Luigi Giussani calls elementary experience. With this term, he refers to the very core of needs and evidence at the heart of a person's relation to reality: truth, justice, freedom, goodness, love, and which are not satisfied by possessing any object within our reach, but rather always beckon to something beyond. In using the concept of experience, Giussani suggests that it is not so much a problem of establishing a theory of man, but of observing his concrete situation in life, which is always open to a greater fulfillment. A reflection on the human comes while we are already living, once we are placed in action on the world stage, what the great Spanish playwright Calderón de la Barca called Gran Teatro del Mundo, the great theater of the world. To put it in another way, it is necessary to be living in the midst of the drama of life, with all its concrete relationships and circumstances, in order to be surprised by what actually fulfills the human vision of what we sense as an original promise of happiness. It is worthwhile to really understand the nature of this experience, since if we do not keep all of its elements in mind, an insistence on the personal moment will only lead to what are individualist and ultimately narcissistic positions, incapable of social construction. Elementary experience, it's a person's own experience, but it is not private. Rather, it opens onto all dimensions of reality. The Spanish philosopher Maria Zambrano already warned us years ago of the risk of impoverishing our elementary experience. I quote her directly. She says, "What is in crisis is this mysterious nexus that unites our being to reality, something so deep and essential that is our inner sustenance." End quote. We call it a weakening of the self. But this crisis affects our sense of the world, of others, and of our very being, keeping us on a rigid or ideological surface of things, thereby shown to be living in uncertainty. Zambrano's is a timely warning that this means losing our inner sustenance, because reality nourishes us when it puts us in contact with this enigmatic something more, which we could call mystery. Despite the frequency with which cultural or psychological causes are mentioned as the root of this weakening, its true root, in my opinion, is more epistemological and anthropological in a deeper sense. What do I mean? I mean that this difficulty comes out from the difficulty in recognizing and welcoming reality in the way in which it immediately appears, without burdening it with the measure of what someone thinks they already know beforehand. Reality that awakens admiration precisely because it's given and at the same time corresponds to the rational structure of every person. An adequate understanding of human elementary experience, capable of perceiving the mysterious nature of reality, and in particular, this point of reality that is each one of us, can tackle the questions of all sorts that contact with the reality inevitably produces in every human person's reason. For by means of a recognition in action, how can we recognize human characteristics, that is to say, the needs and evidence specific to this human experience on a personal and social level, so as to overcome the aforementioned weakening of the self? We should return to the classical task of reflecting on the observations about human condition. But it is possible to do so at this point in time when the common evidence about what it means to be human that we once shared seems to have dissolved in a sea of pluralistic opinions when they aren't contradicting each other. What is the appropriate method? In light of the above, it seems clear that this method can no longer consist in the application of a system of ideas and predetermined values that are abstract, to put it in one way. Indeed, in order to achieve effective social transmission of the principles, values, and ideals that establish a culture, including the religious ones, it is not sufficient to move within the theoretical level, comparing intellectual constructions in order to determine which contains the most truth. The human assimilation of a value relevant to society, such as truth, or justice, or happiness, or friendship, or maternity, or freedom, which are universals in their own right, is because they are part of the elementary experience of everyone, will not occur efficiently if that assimilation does not begin in the concrete experience of having friends, or having a mother, or meeting someone who is already free. It is not enough, for example, for a child to be taught at school that mothers ought to love their children. The child needs to experience being loved. It is only in this way that the child will recognize and know what it means to be loved by a mother. If not, he cannot understand it properly. The most appropriate method for effectively transmitting values involves at least two dimensions. In first place, a pedagogy that allows the recognition in act of common values and shared human characteristics is indispensable. When I say recognition, I'm not just talking about an arbitrary consensus, as the common usage of this category suggests. When I say in act, I mean that true education does not limit itself to simply repeating exact ideas about human nature, but rather allows for the identification of the intellectual content of each truth from lived experience of the common human value in question. Having said that, secondly, we must realize that human ideals and values do not appear to the subject, no matter how prepared and open he is, in a pure state, so to speak, but rather they are assimilated concretely and according to the traits of a concrete human tradition, cultural or religious. For this reason, it is indispensable that the recognition in act of these universal values occur from within what is often called the narration of one's lived tradition. It is in this sense that I wanted to speak at the beginning about the necessity of spaces of action in which universal values are present in a concrete form. In this way, the existence of other potential traditions of values within the same plural society can be respected, and space can emerge for legitimate debate about their greater or lesser suitability to express the fullness of human life. This approach avoids the imposition of one tradition over another and avoids falling into the relativism of mere cultural juxtaposition. What is promoted is the virtuous exchange appropriate to a truly plural society in which democracy as a universal value is lived out with the backing of those dominant traditions that confer the greatest social legitimacy to legal and political proceedings. With regard to the Christian tradition, this double criterion, recognition in act from within the narration of a tradition, have always, in my opinion, formed part of the Church's task, as far as it implies the reality of a particular historical and cultural context in which a new humanity with a universal scope takes shape. This new humanity, which represents a fullness according to the measure of Christ, takes shape thanks to an overabundance beyond mere natural experience from the gratuitous initiative of God. The fifth and last point, the cognitive value of personal encounter. I have maintained that reflecting is not enough for discovering or rediscovering the original characteristics of elementary human experience. We need a space of action that allows for a new intelligence in regards to itself and the world, thanks to a web of relationships. In order to arrive at the fullness of our human experience desires, it's not possible to deduce things starting from principles. This is not wrong, but it's not enough, even if they are the right principles. Rather, it's necessary to discover in action if there is something that, in fact, fulfills and even exceeds that highest longing, a longing reflected in our elementary needs and evidence. Put it in simple terms, something has to happen in our personal life. We need a humanly significant encounter precisely because the self matures in its capacity of knowing both reality and itself through a relationship with others who put the self in movement. That is freedom in act. The self is fulfilled in a you that the self recognizes as its own completeness. This is confirmed in so many examples of daily life where thanks only to the value of an encounter with another, one acquires or regains his self-confidence. It's very difficult to give oneself to himself self-confidence. the intellectual and emotional energy necessary to deal again with life. The lived experiences of maternal love, of friendship, or a relationship with a great teacher, with a master, give witness to this. This condition, specific to the human sphere, is what the Christian proposal must fulfill if it wants to serve the social well-being of the West. In this sense, in front of the great existential questions to which Beck and Bauman and Castells and the others referred to at the beginning, the Christian proposal is to proclaim the initiative of the mystery of God that can be humanly received in a way similar to the way in which we receive other concrete forms of knowledge by means of a personal recognition starting from an intersubjective social context. Indeed, according with Christian faith, every human being may have access to the unrepeatable content of his own being in virtue of a specific event that happens in history. All people have access to the fulfillment of the promise intuited through their elementary needs and evidence, thanks to the relationship with the mystery, which we have experienced through the historical singularity of Jesus Christ, and for the gift of His Spirit, which makes its presence now in history by means of the ecclesial community. In truth, everything I've said now has been born from such a network of relationships, of friendship, which brought me here from Madrid, thanks to which I have been able to know and to love Christ to the point of desiring that this good presence be with me always, and wanting that something like this should happen to everyone here, to all men and women who live in the world. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to David Brooks and Father Javier Prades. I was struck by how, from two very different talks, how we had some important issues that emerged from that. And one that struck me, that we cannot have certainty without undergoing an experience. We need to undergo an experience, and we need to also see an experience in action. When David, when you spoke about the crisis among young people nowadays, it was a prism into our current society and the divisions, polarization of society, the confusion, the ambiguities there. You responded also by speaking very personally, about yourself and you're discovering your desire is going to the depths of yourself in experience. I want to know in our current cultural moment, do you have any example you can think of that makes that made it clear to you of some place to start from, something to start from, something in which we can perceive a promise in our society here in North America or in Europe or anywhere in the world?
Well, despite covering politics, I'm actually wildly and probably unrealistically optimistic about where we're going. In part because the master trend here, I think in the Western society, is the rise of a culture of individualism, and a culture that says life is an individual journey. The essential social unit is the individual chooser. And that what the key question in life is, what can I do to make myself happy? Meaning self-expanded. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that. We're seeing the weakening of social connection. And I think as Father Prades said, I hadn't thought about this, the emphasis on the self leads to a weakening of the self, and a dissolution of the self and a diminution of self-experience. And I would say a degradation of the person. Because when you emphasize the individual chooser, you lose touch with the heart and soul, you lose touch with the deepest part of yourself, and I think we're at the end of that. And what I see all around me, and frankly in this room, is a movement of people just gathering that say the individual is not the essential unit of society, the relationship is the essential unit of society, both the relationship with each other and with some almighty. And what I think this room represents is, frankly, Catholic social thought in physical form. And if I could put it more personally, in the Catholic social teaching of personalism of Jacques Maritain and Dorothy Day, which was so much emphasized that the person is a move outward toward other. And so I see that here, but in my day life, I see it in secular form in the group of community builders who I now spend my life traveling with. My wife, Anne, in her way, in working on character, and I, working at the Aspen Institute, something called the Weave, the Social Fabric Project. We go around in community, looking for communities all around the country that in this context are like little mini cometas. That is to say, mini second families, where people have given themselves up to community, and you can find them everywhere. There's a kid in DC who lost his father when he was 9. His father was murdered by his mistress, and he now works at a football camp, making sure other young men have adult figures. A woman I interviewed in Ohio had the worst thing that can happen to her. Her husband killed their kids and himself. And she decided she would make whatever he tried to do to her, it wasn't going to happen. That she devoted her life to service, to teaching pharmacy, to school. And these people are everywhere. They're a movement that doesn't yet know it's a movement, but they're the living response to an era of excessive individualism. And my basic view is that people figure stuff out. And that a search for community led me to people I'd never heard of, like Jacques Maritain or Augustine. And that yearning for the heart and the soul essentially pulls you back toward a society that's fit for human being and fit for human dignity. And so I just think that is the wave that this movement is part of, a movement of social and spiritual recovery.
Thank you. And Father Prades, I want to ask you a personal question. You know, just looking back at on your life, can you pinpoint a juncture, a moment, you know, where this irreducible expectation became something very clear, very urgent for you?
Well, just today when I was landing at JFK, I remember that the first time I came to America, I was 14, and I was so astonished landing in New York. For a teenager, I came from Spain where, just to give you the context, Spain was still ruled by Franco. And for me, it was a kind of a dream, just sightseeing in Manhattan with open eyes. It seemed so that for the first time in life, you felt that there was something great around, something worthwhile to fight for and to try to. So it became a kind of expectation which remained in coming years. And well, at the beginning, I think I identified that this expectation, this longing for something great could be, yes, the image of myself being successful or being rich or being both. And it remained there. For us, I speak for myself, but for my generation, and it was encouraged by our parents who were all Catholics, that we should be, that the great of life, the aim, the great fulfillment of life, there's a moment where you have to choose what's it. And this is perhaps the first moment I noticed that there was something beyond. It was not enough. It was not enough. And for years, this is a kind of obscure certainty. You cannot tell it. You cannot give words. It's only after 55 years that I can give words to that experience. You are so astonished, you are so surprised that for a moment you can identify the fulfillment of your life with the image of greatness that, for example, New York would represent for a Spanish teenager in the mid-70s. But then you have this drama of life where you have to understand if this is all you can get from life or if there is something deeper which corresponds in a better and a definitive way to your life. And I remember I was 14 when I came here for the first time. Until 16, 17, this is a kind of fight in yourself. Perhaps you wouldn't even tell it. If someone would have asked me, how do you feel? I would have always said, very well. But deep in your heart, you are trying to identify where is the answer to this movement that as a teenager is beginning deep in your heart. And it is why I say I made an encounter which was bigger than New York City. It seems impossible, but it contained the world, the whole world within, the meaning of life, the sense of your life, the sense of history, the value of your activities forever. And you cannot earn money enough, not even here, to pay for it.
It remains for me to thank our two speakers for not having simply given us a talk, but for having invited us into the kitchen of their lives. Invite us to look at their experience, what they're living, and we can live and we can leave here more certain and certainly happier as well. Thank you, David Brooks, and thank you, Father Javier Prades.